What do we know about close to the end of his ministry, the third year of his ministry? Some of the major events. Now, I'm going through these events very fast, as you can tell. I don't have time to cover all of them, so just cover a few of them. We know that he had the miracle of feeding of the 5,000, as we mentioned previously. The discourse of I am the bread of life that occurred there near the Capernaum area. This was a major event. Up to this time, Christ was extremely popular. Great crowds would follow him. And they were looking for miracles and basically for a free meal. He gave them the sermon, I am the bread of life, and told them that you're following me for the wrong reasons. You need to follow my doctrine, not just follow looking for a free meal or for miracles. And many disciples walked no more with him because of that. The same kind of challenge that we have to follow in his doctrine they had. Jesus walked on water during the end of his ministry. He takes his 12 apostles up to a city north of the Sea of Galilee called Caesarea Philippi, and I'll show that to you in just a few minutes. There at Caesarea Philippi, he prophesies of his death and resurrection to his 12 apostles for the first time. From there, he takes his apostles and his three leading apostles, Peter, James, and John, up to the top of this mountain called the Mount of Transfiguration, is what we call it. And during that time, it was a very spiritual event. Moses and Elias appears to them, returns keys, priesthood keys, and other instruction they received. He spends his last 3 months down the southern part of the country, down in Judea and Perea. He raises Lazarus from the dead and then returns to Perea and waiting for that eventful last week. These are some of the trials or the travels that Christ had. You see, he goes quite a ways up north, up unto by Tyre and Sidon area, up in the called the Gentile area, and he travels down the Rift Valley and still spends a lot of his time up in the northern part of the country. These are some of the places. This is where I'm going to take you next, Caesarea Philippi. It's north of Sea of Galilee. And there's two possible locations for the Mount of Transfiguration. Mount Hermon is right here, 7,000 feet high. It is snow-capped part of the year. Some people believe that's the location of the Mount of Transfiguration because it's the highest place. Here's another possible site for the Mount of Transfiguration, Mount Tabor. It's smaller, but a lot of people believe that this actually fits the description better given to us in the records. First, Caesarea Philippi. It was called Panias back prior to the time of Christ because they worshipped a pagan god by the name of Pan there. This is Gentile country, pagan beliefs. There would have been a few Jews, but not very many. It would mostly been Greek influence. Herod the Great built a structure, a temple here to honor the Caesar and dedicated it to Pan. It was eventually, the name of the town was called Banias. That's what the ruins of the city today are called, Banias. But during Christ's time, it would have been called Caesarea Philippi because Herod's son, one of those three sons, had this part of the country that was in his control, and he renamed the city from Panias to Caesarea Philippi by himself, to honor himself and also Caesar. Okay. This is a picture of the old ruins there of the pagan god Pan. They actually had human sacrifice here at times. It was not a very pleasant place to live for a Jew. In the cutouts here, there would have been a temple built around these cutouts in this wall, but there would have been shrines and statues in these cutouts to Athena, Zeus, Aphrodite, and Pan. All of those statues have been found here in the ruins. There's a depiction of Pan on the left here. It's the most decent one I could find. Some of them are not appropriate to even show. But why did Christ take his apostles clear up here to Caesarea Philippi? We don't know, but there's a couple of possibilities. One is to get away from the crowds, to spend a few days with his 12 apostles, preparing them to take the ministry after his life is over and after he leaves them to carry this ministry to the rest of the world. This would be a good location to do that because there were very few Jews up in this area. He could have had his 12 apostles pretty much to himself. Another possibility is to take his apostles here and to teach them the principle to live in the world but not of the world. Okay? It's a beautiful place. It's the headwaters of the Jordan River. Some of the things that occurred here, though, I need to explain this to you. Christ was asking them and teaching them the principles of his gospel, and this is where he first told them that he would die for their sins and be resurrected on the third day. He was asking them, who do you think I am? And he was testing them a little bit. And one of the apostles had said, well, people say that you're so-and-so, and another one said, you're so-and-so. Then Peter stands up and says, thou art Christ, the Son of the living God. And that revelation was given to Peter here at Caesarea Philippi. Two possible locations for the Mount of Transfiguration. The one on the left, the smaller one, Mount Tabor, and the larger one on Mount Hermon. My favorite is Mount Tabor on the left. Here is where some of the priesthood keys were returned to Christ, and he gave them to Peter, James, and John. They heard the voice from the heaven saying from the Father, this is my beloved Son, Jesus Christ. At near the end of his ministry, he travels south and he goes down to Bethany. He raises Lazarus from the dead. He goes up to Ephraim. His life was very threatened at this time. He has a short ministry over into Perea on the right side, that last little red line there, and then returns back to Jerusalem for that last eventful week. I'm going to show you pictures of Bethany, but just before we do, we need to just summarize what happens there. This is the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Also the home of Simon the leper. Now, when Christ returns to Bethany, he spends that Sabbath day, which at that time would have been on Saturday, in the home of Simon the leper. Some people speculate that Simon the leper is probably the father of Mary and Lazarus, because they spent a great deal of time there. But that is speculation. We don't know that for sure. But whatever, Mary does anoint Christ's feet there with oil there in Simon the leper's home. Jesus ascends into heaven here from Bethany. A lot of people think it occurred on Mount of Olives. He was teaching them on the Mount of Olives. It travels over the hill of the Mount of Olives just a little ways. It's real close to the city of Bethany, and goes up into heaven from there. Well, also Lazarus was raised from the dead here in Bethany. This is some of the ruins that how it appears today in Bethany. And one of the sites that I want to show you in Bethany is the Lazarus tomb. You noticed I have entombed for 4 days on the left side there. The reason that's important is Christ at this point had already raised 2 other people from the dead, but they were within a 3-day period. There was kind of a belief or traditional thinking at the time that if a person had only been dead for a day or 2 and then they were brought back to life, maybe they weren't dead after all because the spirit was still kind of mingling around for 3 days. So to get out of that thought process, Christ intentionally waited for the 4th day, as you noticed in the records. He heard of Lazarus being sick and then dies, and he waits to the 4th day before he comes back to Bethany to raise him from the dead, intentionally to get away from that thought process so the people might not speculate differently. But the Lazarus tomb, that last picture I showed you, was probably about 20 feet higher than what it would have been originally at the time of Christ. People, when they live in an area, they always fill up with dirt. So the entrance point to the Lazarus tomb is higher today than it was back in the old days. The original entrance to the tomb is no longer available. We go through that door that you saw on the right, and then down through the top of the tomb you see in the picture here, in order to be able to get into Lazarus' tomb. This is my son sitting in Lazarus' tomb looking out towards us. Possibly this picture right here is an artist's interpretation of more likely what the entrance would have looked like at the time of Christ. Now you notice the individual to the right there, one of the Sanhedrin, either Sadducee or Pharisee, they were present when he raised Lazarus from the dead. Christ knew that and wanted that to occur. He wanted to be sure that people knew that he was the Messiah. There was a lot of Jews, a lot of people around during that time period too. This was one of the ways that he was revealing himself right at the end of his ministry, who he really was. Now the way the Bethany sits from Jerusalem, Bethany is about 2 miles to the east. You go from the little town of Bethany up over the top of the knoll of this hill called the Mount of Olives, and down the slope on an angle into Jerusalem. And during that last week of Christ's life, he would have spent every evening traveling back to Bethany from Jerusalem, from his teachings and so on. And so he spent every evening during that last week in Bethany in the house of his friends. This picture here depicts Christ's entrance into Jerusalem, riding on a white colt or ass, donkey. This was all fulfillment of prophecy from the Old Testament time. In fact, back in the Old Testament time, royalty would ride a donkey like this. So this was all symbolic as well as fulfilling prophecy. Now I'm going to walk you through the map of Jerusalem, and then I'm going to show you pictures of a model city of Jerusalem to help you understand how the city was laid out at the time of Christ. And I think this will help you when you read the scriptures. You'll notice that this big line here on the right side of the map, number 13 right there, is the Kidron Valley. It's the deepest valley that surrounds the city of Jerusalem. There's another valley right there, is called the Tyropoeon Valley. So in between those two valleys is, you see a wall, and that would have been the Old Testament city of Jerusalem. Not very big in scope. Then we have another valley that is on the west side of Jerusalem, the Hinnom Valley, and it circles around and finally joins with the other two valleys to the right side of the picture. This portion right there between the Kidron Valley and the Tyropoeon Valley is the Old Testament city of Jerusalem. It's the city of David. It sits on Mount Opal, they call it, not very big in scope. This right here is the lower part of Jerusalem. It's the poorer section. And this right here is the upper part of the city. It's called in the scriptures, and it's where the wealthier people would have lived. Right here, this group of buildings on the left side of the picture there is Herod's palace or Herod's complex. The building up there with the 4 large columns is Antonio's fortress. This is where the Roman soldiers would have spent their time when they were here in Jerusalem. The 4 large columns would have been for protection, but also be able to look over the wall into the Temple Mount to make sure that the people were obeying laws and not preparing for a revolt of some kind. Because during the Feast of the Passovers, there would have been a large group of people from all parts of the country in here in Jerusalem. This last arrow is the Temple Mount, very large in scope. And that southeast corner is what I'm going to use kind of a landmark. It's the pinnacle of the temple. This is where one of the temptations of Christ was given. That arrow also lays right over the top of some trees. Those trees are the Garden of Gethsemane. Now we'll take you to this model city. It's built out of one of the hotels in Jerusalem there. This model city is 1/4 inch equals 1 foot. A man is 1.5 inches tall to put things per scale. It's made per scale as close as we can identify. Anytime any archaeological diggings occur there, they come back, they check this model city. If there's any things need to be corrected, they correct them to keep it as accurate as possible to what we believe the city of Jerusalem looked like at the time. Now back to this picture here. On the right side, you see people standing. This is where the Kidron Valley would have been. That Kidron Valley is not per scale on this model city because we need to be able to look into the city. If it was per scale, it would have been deeper on the right side than it would have been on the left. The left side is the Tyropoeon Valley. The right side is the Kidron Valley, which is deeper. filled in just for us as tourists to be able to look into the model city. Other than that, the city is per scale. That's the Old Testament city of David. The southeast corner of the Temple Mount, the pinnacle of the temple. This is what it would have looked like at the time of Christ. From the pinnacle of the temple, in all per scale, it's 211 feet from the top to the bottom of the foundation, and 400 feet from the top of the pinnacle to the bottom of the Kidron Valley, to give that to you in scope. This is what it looks like from today. This is a picture I took. That southeast corner is on the left portion, the close left portion of that Temple Mount to you. You can see from there down to the Kidron Valley is quite a lengthy place. Now, I want to point out a few things right on this picture. On the right portion of the picture, a big round gold dome is called the Dome of the Rock, or the Mosque of Omar. It's built over a large stone inside that. It's a mosque to the Muslims, and it's a very large structure. You see it in the news, and you've seen it in all kinds of pictures and so on. Large in structure. Keep that in mind. I'm going to use that as a relationship to the inner part of the temple in a minute. Do you see where the pinnacle of the temple is? Just to the left of the pinnacle of the temple, there's some steps going up into the temple. That's where I'm going to take you next. And looking across the Kidron Valley, there's a bunch of grave sites right below us here. I keep that in mind as well. Now, those are those steps that I just was pointing out to you. The actual picture on the left, and the model city on the right. This is where Christ would have stood when he's calling the hypocrites, calling the Sanhedrin, Sadducees and Pharisees, hypocrites. And he's pointing to his left across the Kidron Valley. And he's pointing to these white sepulchres and telling them they're hypocrites. They're like white sepulchres. They're white on the outside, but full of dead man's bones on the inside. He's using that as something that people can relate to. He's looking across the Kidron Valley and pointing that out to them. That most likely occurred right here on these steps. It's almost a natural theater that you could stand in the top, and a lot of people could be down below you and hear you, like he would have used at the Sea of Galilee when he gave the Sermon on the Mount. Now back to the picture here, the one on the right, the model city. You see two doors, the one on the right and the one on the left. When the Jews would have gone into Jerusalem to do temple work, they would have done some ceremonial washings down here, out of the picture, but close to these steps. They would have walked through that door on the right. It's one of the Huldah gates. It's the door on the right is the Huldah gate they would enter into. That brings them up into the middle part of the Temple Mount. They go into the inner part of the temple to do their temple work. And then when they leave, they come out on the door on the left. I'm going to walk you through now just a map of that Temple Mount to help you understand how this would work. This right here is the pinnacle of the temple. That's my landmark right there again. You see the Huldah gates just to the left of that arrow. Surrounding the inner part of the temple, to the south and to the north, is what we call the Court of the Gentiles. Anybody was allowed to come into this part of the temple. Now, if you're not doing temple work, you can also come into the temple from those entrances on the left. You can see there's two different possibilities there. And there's one on the right as well. Anybody can go into the Court of the Gentiles, but only Jews can go in the inner part of the temple. And they took this very seriously. They would have little signs of warning, and there had even been people put to death that were not Jewish that would enter the inner part of the temple. They took that very seriously. This part right here on the outer part of the Temple Mount on the east side is called the Solomon's Porch. This is important for you to know. This is where Christ would have been teaching the learned men when he was 12 years old, because it's identified so as the Solomon's Porch. A couple other events that occurred there. This is where Christ would have testified that he was the Son of God. This is where Peter and John preached and were arrested by the officers of the Sanhedrin. Occurred right here in Solomon's Porch. Don't let this picture fool you. This is a large area, okay? Solomon's Porch, as it would have been all the way around the Temple Mount, would have been large stone columns, each 37 feet high. My next picture now is looking directly through the Susa gate, right into the inner part of the temple. Here's looking towards the inner part of the temple. Now you can see those columns I just referred to on the left and the right side of the picture there. There would have been hundreds of those stone columns, each one of them a piece of art. Each of those columns is 37 feet tall, okay, carved out of one stone, every one of them. And it's called the porches or basilicas. It's columns, covered areas, okay, and that occurred all the way around. So just on the other side of this wall that you were just looking at a minute ago would have been Solomon's porch. A lot of great events occurred that, and that's right close to the entrance to the inner part of the temple. That's why they would be preaching there. Now, I wanted you to remember how tall that Dome of the Rock was, and this is the reason. The Holy of Holies, or the sanctuary to the inner part of the temple, is on the left, and this relationship to the size of the Dome of the Rock on the right. You can see how massive in size that inner part of the temple was. Let's walk you through the inner parts of the temple now to help you understand and identify some places you might read of in the Scriptures. The model city's on the left, and of course the map's on the right. That first arrow there is the entrance to the end part of the temple. It's called the Beautiful Gate. It was beautiful in color, but also that was the name of it. This is referred to in the Scriptures. A couple of events occurred here. This is where Peter and John healed a lame man after Christ ascended into heaven. He was there by that gate, and they would have leaned down and healed him and walked into the inner temple with him. This is Court of the Women. Any Jew can enter this part of the area. This is where the woman taken in adultery would have been brought to Christ. This is one of the ways the Sanhedrin were trying to trick him, actually. That occurred right here in the Court of the Women. On both sides of the Court of Women would have been large chests with little slots in the top of it, sort of like a large piggy bank. This is what they call the treasury. So when you read about the treasury, you can think of the Court of the Women and large piggy banks on the edges of the Court of the Women. This is where the widow would have put her mite in there during that last week that Christ had talked about the widow's mite. That occurred right here, what they call the treasury. Now going from the Court of the Women, you go up steps again, up into a place where only the officers and the high priest were allowed to go into. Women were not allowed to go up into this area. On the left side of that is a chamber of the hewn stone. This is a gathering place for the Sanhedrin. Sadducees, Pharisees, and a few scribes and lawyers would meet here. Any of those people in power, 40 of them in total. This is where they would meet. This is where they would have tried to figure out what they can do to trick Christ in a trick question to therefore have a way to get rid of him, because he was really more of a threat to them than anything close to his ministry. This is where they have met. This is also the court of the chamber of the hewn stone is also where Paul would have been brought and testified to the Sanhedrin. Those two structures right there, the one on the top left, the laver is a large brass wash basin built on 12 lions. This is where they would have washed the animals. And the one on the right would have been the large altar. That altar was 48 feet square. Some people think the altar was built, used and built right over that large rock that's inside the Dome of the Rock that stands there today, because it's about the same size and, of course, the same location. That last arrow is the Holy of Holies, or the sanctuary. This is where Zacharias and Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, would have met and had their discussion about John the Baptist prior to Christ's coming. I hope that helps to walk through some of those areas you will read about in the Scriptures. Now, going a little further north, looking back now on this model city, you can see this Temple Mount. To give you a size of how large this is, it's 40 acres large. That's humongous in size. I don't know how many football fields would fit in there, but quite a few, okay? This was a very large structure. It was the most expensive and magnificent temple complex in all of Greco-Roman world. It was a magnificent structure. It took 10,000 workmen 8 years to build. Of those 10,000 workmen, 1,000 was priests and 1,000 wagons. We know that because it was identified such, but it was a very expensive structure. Twice as large as Solomon's temple, by the way, that Herod had rebuilt. Going further north, I want to point out just one event occurred here in the pools of Bethsaida. Paul refers to pools of Bethsaida as having 5 porches. We couldn't identify that and figure that out until we excavated it. The 5 porches include a porch on each side plus one running across the middle. You can see a closer picture now on the right side there. That's the one crossing the middle, so you have 5 porches. The event that occurred here, I think, is worth mentioning. Christ heals a lame man that had been paralyzed for 38 years. This man was a Jew. He was physically crippled, but he also had left his religion, and he was kind of a social outcast. He'd come down here to the pools of Bethesda. There were bubbles that would come up into the water, and some people thought that might be miraculous healings or so on. That was pretty much just a pagan belief. Nothing of importance to it, but he was down there, really kind of left his religion and no longer met with his own people. When Christ healed him, this man was found up in the temple, praising God, talking to his own people again, and he was not only healed physically, he was healed socially and as well as spiritually. He has the power to heal us of all of our ailments if we but return to him. This is the picture as it appears of the pools of Bethesda as they look today. Those columns with the cross on it were built by the Crusaders when they occupied this area. But if you look down into the ground there, about 30 feet down, 25 feet down, you'll see the original pools of Bethesda with some of the original columns. They're still present. Walking a little further north of this model city, out on this end of the city is where Stephen would have been stoned after he testified of Christ. A little further to the north, somewhere out in this area is Golgotha. And I'm going to walk clear over to those people on the right side of the picture now and look back towards the Temple Mount. So we're looking back to the Temple Mount. The Herod's palace is right here in front. This is one of the places that Christ would have been brought in that last evening of trials. This whole area right along this picture here is Herod's complex. They didn't hold any expense back building structures for their people that would visit them and their friends and so on the taxation and backs of their own people. And back almost to the starting point now, this is the lower part of the city with the Tyropian Valley just to the right side there. Now what happens in that last week? We know some events occurred. I'll just mention a few here. On Sabbath, which would have been Saturday, Christ comes into Bethany. He spends that Sabbath day in the home of Simon the leper. This is where Mary anoints Christ's feet. This would have been a place where people are gathering, coming in and out, talking to Lazarus. He's a walking miracle. Talking to Simon the leper. He's also a walking miracle. And it would have been a place to be. Day 1 is on Sunday. Christ has a triumphal entry on the donkey. Goes into the temple and he observes the temple. On day 2, he cleanses the temple along with a bunch of other teachings. I find that fascinating. People think he loses control and gets very like a madman during that temple cleansing. Of course, he does not, because he even observes and comes back the second day to cleanse it. Day 3 is a majority of the trick questions that are brought to him from the Sanhedrin. Actually, maybe not the majority, but the last ones. Some major ones occurred during this time, such as the tribute money. They're trying to find a way to trick him so that they can have a trial on him and get rid of him. The tribute money, and he says, rend that to what belongs to Caesar, and what belongs to God, God's. Another trick question, the Great Commandment. The Great Commandments, first, love the Lord thy God and love thy neighbor as thyself. The widow's mite would have occurred on that last day. After day 3, the Sanhedrin did not spend time with him, they figured out another way to get rid of him. Day 4 we know nothing about. Nothing's mentioned on that day. Some people speculate he spent it with family and friends. Day 5, of course, is the Last Supper, the Garden of Gethsemane, the Atonement, and the trials start. And day 6, the trials continue through that day, and he's crucified, and he dies sometime in the afternoon on day 6, on Friday. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. If you want to know how the 3 days fit in, the Jews judge days by sunset. And this say the sunset occurs 6 in the afternoon. So 5 in the afternoon would be a different day than 7 in the afternoon, if that makes sense to you. So a few hours before sunset would be a different day than a few hours after. So sometime in the afternoon of Friday, he's buried. So there's a part of day on Friday, a full day on Saturday, where his body laid in a tomb, and the scriptures say that his spirit went up in his spirit prison, and he prepared missionary work to be fulfilled there in the spirit prison. Day 6, sometime on day 6, he's resurrected. Another part of a day, but the way the Jews judge days, a part of a day, a full day, and a part of a day would still be 3 days. Some of the events that occurred on that last evening. That picture right there depicts Peter denying Christ for the 3rd time. Now we'll walk you through how this occurred on that last evening of his life. Number 1 there is the upper part of the city. This is where the sacrament was introduced, and his Last Supper. They walked down the Kidron Valley up into the Garden of Gethsemane, up into the trees on number 2 there. From there he's taken captive down to Annas' home very briefly, and then Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest. Annas was a high priest prior to Caiaphas and also the father-in-law to Caiaphas. Annas also controlled the money changers on the Temple Mount. Very wealthy man, very powerful. And so when Christ cast the money changers out of the temple, what he is doing is he has his hands in Annas' pockets. Annas didn't like that. So Annas wanted to talk to him for a few minutes. He goes to Caiaphas, the high priest at the time. He's buffeted. He's taken from there up to number 4, Antonio's fortress, questioned by Pontius Pilate. He's taken from there down to Herod's palace because he's a Galilean. And Herod sends him back up to Pontius Pilate. No one really wanted to accuse him because it was all illegal. All these trials were all illegal. If we had time, we'd go through the illegalities of those trials. From there, eventually, the people threatened Pilate that if you don't crucify him, you're not a friend of Caesar's. That was a threat that Pilate could not withstand, and then he's sent out, sentenced to death, and he's taken out to Golgotha, and he's crucified. We'll show you some of the sights now. This is what we call the upper room. Of course, it's not the actual room because all the buildings in Jerusalem from ground level up were destroyed after Christ's ministry, about 30 years after his death. But this is built over an ancient building that everybody depicts as the traditional spot. If it's not the actual spot, it's very close to it. Our group goes up into that upper room there, and we sing hymns and read the scriptures. It's a very spiritual, uplifting event. From there, we walk into the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, we do know that this is the actual Garden of Gethsemane. Some of the trees are very old here, like that one right there, for example. They would not have been the original trees at the time of Christ because Titus, the Roman ruler that took over Jerusalem during that Jewish revolt in 70-72 AD, would have cut all the trees down. But botanists have been here and taken core samples and feel that they date back to the time of Christ. So the trees, some of them, might have grown out of the root systems that actually were there at the time of Christ. It's a very special place to be. As you're in the Garden of Gethsemane, you can look down into the Kidron Valley. From here at night, you could have seen a group of men with torches coming up that Kidron Valley to take you captive. Obviously, Christ saw them coming. From there, he was taken captive up into Caiaphas's home. That chapel on the top of the hill there is built on the foundation of Caiaphas's home. Christ would have been taken right up those steps. Those steps date prior to the time of Christ. From there, he's taken to Antonio's fortress. This is where Christ would have stood. These stones are original. This is part of the outer court of the Antonio's fortress. Christ would have stood on these stones, be looking up to Pontius Pilate. Pilate would have been on a higher balcony, looking down towards Christ, at least the first time he questioned him. And this is the outer ports of that court that Christ actually would have stood on. Two possible locations for burial. Holy Sepulchre, this is one location that many people believe is the right place of his burial. If not, it's close to it. It's a very fascinating structure. 9 different religions have a little bit of occupancy of this building. Very fascinating structure. It dates back to 300 AD also. This is one picture depicted on the inside. Be sure and visit the Holy Sepulchre if you're ever there in Jerusalem. It's a fascinating structure to visit. This is what some people depict as the actual place where the cross was. Garden Tomb is another possible location that some people believe. I show these pictures to you not to show that this is the actual place, because I don't know, but you get a special feeling here. It might be because you're just feeling of the atonement and the resurrection. I'm not sure. But there's a couple of things I want to point out to you. You see, this is the entrance to the tomb here in the Garden Tomb. Right to the front of it is a trough on the ground there. This would have been where a large round stone would have been rolled back and forth to secure the tomb. This is looking right down into the trough. This would have helped to keep the stone in place. Now this picture right here is just an artist's interpretation, kind of helps you understand how that actually would have worked. Round so that men could have rolled it, but it would have been heavy so they could actually secure it. And that trough would have helped keep it in place. This is the tomb itself. This is where the body would have been placed. And you see at the right side of the tomb, that extension on that place of burial extended out about 6 feet. It's carved out very quickly. So the person who occupied this tomb was apparently taller than the person who originally it was carved for. I find that very fascinating. It's my daughter on the right, just about entrance to the tomb there. Visit the Garden Tomb. It's a very special place as well. This takes us back to the Temple Mount in the evening. This is the end of my presentation. I hope some of these sites actually help you, so that when you read the scriptures and you put the test that we talked about earlier this evening about if you want to know whether the doctrine to be true, put it to the test and you know whether it is God or from man. I have done that, and I found that this doctrine is true. It's important to read the scriptures and to apply this doctrine to your lives so that you can prepare for the second coming of Christ. And the most important thing is, out of all the names that Christ has, out of all of his titles, my favorite is brother. Because brother I can relate to very easily. I love Christ. I believe he is my Savior. He's the creator of the world. He is my dear friend, and I love him for it. And I give you these thoughts and feelings and share this information with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
What happens to the person who doesn't lift up their hand? They start the work, they don't get the blessing of it. You don't get the blessing of marriage if you give up. You don't get the blessing of ministry if you give up. You don't get the blessing of anything in life, in God, if you give up. Finish the marriage. You started. You know they did studies, marriages with severe problems, and you know what happened?